solemnly swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally had attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie, we're together exploring the military orders and the Crusades. In this episode, we're going to meet again the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers. We met them originally in the Crusades, and now we're going to continue their story from Rhodes to the Siege of Malta. So, Jamie, I think we should start by recapping on who these Hospitallers are. We've been covering several centuries of history, so take us back briefly to the Crusades and tell us what hospital and who were the chaps running it.
Well, as we mentioned in the previous episode, the Hospitallers were one of the two major, or possibly three, including the Teutonic Knights and the Templars, major religious military orders that defended the borders and frontier of Christendom, particularly in Palestine, in the Holy Land, where the incursions of the Muslim raiders and armies was at its greatest. And if we remember, they had a particular charism, a very attractive, very Christian charism, whereby the wealthy, the great and powerful served the poorest of the poor, because they were primarily an hospitaller order. But they also were a military order, like the Templars, whose task was to defend Christendom, to defend the Holy Land, to defend the holy places of Jerusalem and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. But we last saw them being expelled from the Latin Kingdom, which fell with the fall of Acre, the city of Acre, in 1291. And thereafter they then moved to Rhodes, which they'd captured. They were then defeated there by the Muslims some years later and were forced to move again. We remember the figure of Baibars, that former slave who became the Mamluk leader, and then the great Sultan that finally defeated the Crusaders. He was a much less attractive figure than Salah ad-Din, who had defeated the Christian Crusaders, a previous generation. He was a much more savage figure, a much more brutal figure, given to going back on his word and massacring civilians. After him comes the Ottoman Turks. He himself was a Turkish slave, Baibars, but he is superseded in due course by the Ottoman Turks, who are the new, as it were, spearhead of Islam, and remain so for many years after, until they too are finally meet their match. So we find the Knights Hospitaller, the Knights of St. John, on Rhodes, and then being moved on from Rhodes, they having withstood two further invasions by the Sultan of Egypt in 1444 and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II in 1480, who, after capturing Constantinople, made the Knights of the Hospital, because bear in mind by now the Templars had been suppressed, made the Knights of the Hospital his primary target, realizing that they were his greatest potential obstacle to taking over the whole of Christendom. So they created a stronghold in the peninsula of Halicarnassus, now called Bodrum, in 1494, but they were then pushed on from there, and they had to find somewhere else to go. And in 1522, an entirely new sort of force arrived, 400 ships under the command of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Solomon, same thing, and he delivered 200,000 men to the island. And against this force, the Knights, under Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, had about 7,000 men at arms, and their fortifications. Siege lasted 6 months, at the end of which the Hospitallers were defeated. But they were allowed to withdraw. They withdrew to Sicily and there pondered for 7 years, moving about from place to place where they might next go. And it was in 1530 that the Emperor Charles V well, he was originally from Spain, but King of Spain, but he became the Holy Roman Emperor, gave them, as King of Sicily, the islands of Malta and Gozo, and the North African port of Tripoli, in a perpetual fiefdom in exchange for an annual fee of a single Maltese falcon, which they were to send on All Souls' Day to the King's representative, the Viceroy in Sicily. And this historical fact was, of course, the basis of the plot in Dashiell Hammett's famous book, The Maltese Falcon. Well, what did they do when they were there? Well, they established themselves in Malta, and they continued their actions defending the southern flank of Christendom.
And let's just stop for a moment to think about Malta, to this day a very Catholic island, and famous because St. Paul brought the faith there, and as he himself describes, and was shipwrecked there. So we have here a retreat, if you like, into the very different world from the Holy Land, right back via Rhodes to this island of Malta, which was Catholic, and where they would find a refuge among a Catholic people.
That's right. The Maltese, in fact, had been conquered a number of times, not least, of course, by the Arabs. They were, I think it's fair to say, originally a Phoenician people. That's how they like to see themselves. But the language that they spoke then, as they do today, is really a variant of Arabic. But they have always distinguished themselves very strongly from the Muslim Arabs and regard themselves as a very, very much a Christian people, and they are to this day a very strongly Christian and Catholic people. Not least, perhaps, because of the influence of the Knights, but not only because of that. Well, the Knights, once settled there, continued to protect the southern flank of Christendom, particularly from Muslim pirates, particularly the Berber pirates, the Barbary pirates, who made it their business to run up and down the coast of southern Europe, making raids, taking away children, women, and enslaving them, which, as we've seen much earlier, the Quran did not forbid. Well, pretty soon the Ottomans were not happy with the Hospitallers attacking these Barbary corsairs. And so it was decided by Suleiman the Magnificent, then probably the greatest and most powerful Muslim leader, that he would send an invasion force to oust his great enemies, the Knights Hospitaller, from their stronghold in Malta. He sent a force of about 40,000 men to besiege a garrison of only 700 knights and 8,000 soldiers, including Maltese soldiers, to expel them from Malta. And at first, the siege went badly for the Hospitallers, as it had done in Rhodes. Most of the cities were destroyed, and about half of the knights were killed. But, well, indeed, it's fair to say on the 18th of August of that year, 1565, the position of the besieged was becoming pretty desperate, and they were seemingly unable to defend themselves. And the council of the then Grand Master suggested the abandonment of the peninsula called Il Borgo and Sanglea, two peninsulas, and withdrawal to the primary fort of Fort St. Angelo. But Grand Master Jean Parisot de la Valette, who was one of the most memorable of the Grand Masters, being a man of considerable courage and strength and foresight, refused this.
So you have here this, the scene is set for one of these great images, really, of European and of Christian history, this siege of Malta. And because Malta is an island with these remarkable people with this strong Catholic heritage, the whole thing has already begins to acquire the patina of folklore, even as the story unfolds. But they would have been very isolated. I mean, it's not a bit of an obvious cliche to say so, but they couldn't radio for help. They couldn't even send a letter. There's no way they could send an email. So you have this isolated fortress relying really on their own faith and strength and ingenuity, the knights and the Maltese people.
Well, indeed. Malta is quite close to Sicily, and they legitimately expected assistance from the King of Sicily's viceroy, because Charles V was the king originally. He had established a viceroy. And to be fair, the viceroy had intended to help them. He, in fact, had sent his own son, who was fighting alongside the knights. But for various reasons, he wasn't able to get round the Muslim defences. So effectively the knights and their Maltese soldiery and the people of Malta were on their own. This was truly a great siege. And if they had failed to keep Malta, then this could have meant exposing Sicily and Naples to the Ottomans, and if they'd established a foothold there, once again Christendom could be threatened by being overwhelmed completely by Islam. However, the battle went rather differently. So
just to pause here to give this image, we have the long, thin peninsula, the stocking-shaped peninsula of Italy going down into the Mediterranean, and Malta, which has suddenly found itself, because of the presence of the knights and so on, in this extraordinarily symbolic and crucial position. And because they know this through their own history, they're aware of what they must do. So we have this sort of small island of Christianity with, it looks like going to be facing the full horror of a massive naval engagement, about which they can do very little, because their nearest source of help has proved not to be as useful as they would expect. And everyone else is either rather a long way away or has grave problems of their own.
Well, exactly. And in the usual way with the Turkish leaders, Suleiman had said he'd sent forward messengers saying, surrender, render yourselves up so that we can decapitate you. And there was no kind of honourable way out. It was a fight to the last, with no quarter on the side, at least, of the Turkish besiegers. Well, it proved to be one of the great battles in the history of Christendom. An assault was undertaken and only thrown back with great difficulty. And the fortress of St. Elmo had to fight effectively to the last man. It held out as long as possible. Grand Master Valette, who had the foresight to see that it was necessary for them to continue to fight as long as they could, ordered them to fight to the last man, which they did, causing great losses and delay to the Turkish forces, who were beginning to feel the problems of this long supply line all the way back to Constantinople, which of course was now in Muslim hands. And in addition, the effect of diseases spreading in their camp. At length St. Elmo was taken. A single Maltese soldier swam across the Grand Harbour to Sanglaire to inform Grand Master Valette. A few of the knights had been taken prisoner. They were crucified by the Turks, and their crosses, with them on them, sent across Grand Harbour to Valette. Valette responded by firing the decapitated heads of dead Turks from cannons across the harbour into the Turkish camp. Well, you can see what kind of a battle it was. Pretty fierce, pretty rough, pretty brutal. However, with the exception of Fort St. Elmo, the main fortifications of Malta remained intact, and they held out. Many of the Ottoman troops in their crowded quarters, with this long supply line, had begun to fall ill over the terrible summer months. And remember, we're in a Maltese summer here, boiling hot, with both sides in armour, their knights at any rate. And some of the knights, after fighting, simply expired from heat exhaustion, fighting on until they literally collapsed. The Ottomans then suffered one of their great losses in that on the 23rd of June, their great and skilled commander Dragut, an Ottoman corsair and admiral, was killed by a stray Arab. And that took a lot of the fight out of the Turks, because he was a great inspiration as a commander. The then remaining Turkish commanders, Piali Pasha and Mustafa Pasha, were not so good. And on the 1st of September, they made another effort to attack the fortress, which was holding out by, as it were, the fingernails. And both sides were now really getting to the stage where they were on their last legs. The attack was a feeble one, and to the great encouragement of the besieged, I should say, they did not succeed, and the besieged began now to see, the knights began to see that they might in fact succeed and be delivered. So what happened next was that the Ottomans heard that there had been an arrival of Sicilian reinforcements in Maliha Bay. In fact, it was a very small reinforcement, but they weren't to know that. And they, in fact, broke off the siege, exhausted, embattled, having suffered huge losses, despite the Crusaders' force being rather smaller, and then they themselves, the Turks, suffering considerable losses from disease. And finally, on the 8th of September, the feast of the Nativity of Our Lady, they broke off the siege and departed the island, so that day is seen as the great day of victory for the siege of Malta, and is celebrated in the Order of Malta to this day as Victoria Day, as well, of course, as the birthday of Our Lady.
And celebrated very much by the Maltese with special masses and celebrations and so on, and it's very much bound up with their national devotion to Our Lady, and this is really seen as Malta Day, also by Maltese living overseas.
Indeed it is. The Great Siege of Malta is really one of the greatest offences ever to have been undertaken by a small force against a much larger besieging force. I think it's fair to say it's truly one of the great military feats of history. A force of only 700 knights and 7,000 or 8,000 men against a besieging force of some 40,000. When the Ottomans departed, the Hospitallers had only 600 men able to bear arms, and the Ottoman army had been reduced from 40,000 to only some 15,000 who returned with their tails between their legs, as it were, to Constantinople. It was a huge victory for the Knights of Malta.
And bought at a very heavy price. What about the relics of this still in Malta? It's still possible to visit these places, and of course the Valletta is now the name of the harbour, and so on and so on.
Well, it is, and what happened was, out of the wealth that they then accumulated, because they captured some wealth from the Ottomans, but they were then showered with arms and money and resources from the kings of Christendom, who saw them as the principal defenders of the southern flank of Christendom. And so the Grand Master, La Valette, was able to rebuild a city on the peninsula which Fort St. Helmo is, and that became the city of Valletta, named after him. By the way, Valette, during the time that he was the commander of the siege, was aged 72.
Good gracious, that's a lesson for us all.
He was a man of immense strength. He had, in fact, been in the galleys as a Muslim galley slave, not a Muslim, but a galley slave of the Muslims for a whole year, and had survived. And if you survived that, you were obviously a person of considerable physical strength. After that time, the Grand Masters of the hospital, of the Order of St. John, the Hospitallers, became a great figure, a magnate in Christendom. In 1607, the Grand Master was granted the title and status of Reichsfürst, a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, even though he wasn't part of the Holy Roman Empire. And in 1630, he was also awarded the ecclesiastical quality of a cardinal. And the unique hybrid style which the Grand Master has to this day, His Most Eminent Highness, reflects his quality both as a prince of the Church and a prince of the Empire. A unique combination, perhaps, but one that continues to this day, and shows you how importantly the Church and the State in Christendom regarded the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta.
So this idea of it being important was true. It really was, not just in image, but in absolute political and geographical terms, an extremely important siege.
Yes, and they after that time, consolidating their power in Malta, were able to, in effect, police the Mediterranean from the Barbary corsairs, particularly after the Battle of Lepanto, which was another attempt by the Ottomans to defeat the Christian fleets. They, in fact, were defeated themselves, again with the assistance of the Knights Hospitaller, because they ran galleys and fleets. And after that time, the Mediterranenean was, again, much less troubled by Barbary corsairs, because it was so well policed by the Order of Malta.
And Malta, of course, has famously remained extremely Catholic, and is Catholic to this day. Not only a wonderful Catholic culture of which to be part and so on, but something of an example to the rest of Europe in these rather ghastly
yes, and
secularizing times.
It mustn't be forgotten that the Maltese people themselves were an immensely brave people who, we know this, of course, from during the Second World War, when the island was bombarded by the Nazis. But during the course of the siege of Malta, they also showed themselves as extremely valuable soldiers and defenders of their island in alliance with the Knights of Malta. And one must never forget that. What happened thereafter was, of course, the Protestant Reformation in due course affected the Knights of Malta, because they didn't have only Malta. They still had all their estates in the rest of Europe, which raised revenues for the policing of the Mediterranean, the protection of now the southern flank, again still a frontier, even though a naval frontier. But the Protestant Reformation hit them hard because they began to lose a lot of those lands, and that meant that their revenues were, of course, affected. The property of the English branch was confiscated in 1540.
As part of Henry VIII's destruction of all things Catholic and the religious orders and so on, we need to put that in context.
Yes.
In the reign of Henry VIII, yes.
Exactly. You can still see in St John's Gate in London the remnants of the principal headquarters of the Priory of St John in London, but they were denuded of all of that at the Reformation by Henry VIII. The same happened in Germany in 1577. The German bailiwick of Brandenburg became Lutheran. It continued to pay its financial contribution to the order, but eventually that ceased when it was turned into an order of merit by the King of Prussia in 1812, and later on the Johanniter order was set up as a Prussian order of Knights Hospitaller. Eventually, of course, came the French Revolution, and in 1789 the French Revolutionary National Assembly, abolishing the feudal system, also abolished the Order of Malta in France and seized all their estates, as indeed it had done with much of the church's estates. And so the Order of Malta effectively came to an end in France. It also came to an end in Malta. The reason for this was because Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798, during his expedition to Egypt, as a ruse, asked for safe harbour to resupply his ships in the Maltese harbour. And then the Knights of Malta, having agreed to do so, perhaps foolishly, he turned upon them, and once safely inside Valletta, he used the opportunity to attack the Knights, and doing so by surprise, he seized the island. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch was unprepared for this, and effectively the island had to capitulate to Bonaparte, and in 1799 von Hompesch resigned, and the Knights were effectively dispersed. What happened after that is an interesting story too, because they went, many of them, to Russia, were given protection by the Tsar Paul I, who took a shine to the Order of Malta, liked their chivalric ideals, and eventually persuaded some of them to illegally elect him to be the Grand Master of the Order, even though he wasn't a Catholic. He was Russian Orthodox. This, of course, was de facto, not de jure, was not recognized by the Pope, and subsequently had to be rescinded. But nonetheless, the Tsar Paul had done a great thing in preserving much of the Order's remaining heritage, which otherwise might have been extinguished by the French Revolution.
And as we mentioned in an earlier programme about the Knights, that whole idea of the Knights Hospitaller and so on remains today. Not only does the order exist with its headquarters in Rome and a Grand Master, the current one is an Englishman and so on, but the tradition of it continues in the St John Ambulance, the Malteser, as they also have for young people in Austria and in Germany, and in the familiar idea of learning first aid through the St John Ambulance Society. That's still, actually, it's St John.
Yes, indeed.
And it's still there.
And what happened was that the government of the order went into the hands of lieutenants, because the Grand Master during the period 1805 to 1879 wasn't elected because they didn't really have anywhere to go. Eventually they ended up in Rome, where they are to this day in the Palazzo di Malta in the Via Condotti in Rome. But in 1879, Pope Leo XIII restored a Grand Master to the order, and this signalled the renewal of the order's fortunes, but this time as a purely humanitarian and religious organisation, which it continues to be. It is and remains a religious order of the Catholic Church, with memories of its military history, but largely now concentrated on its hospitaller works. And it runs hospitals, clinics, hospices for the dying, AIDS clinics, maternity clinics, homes for old people all across the world. And as I said in a previous programme, in this series, it dispenses something like in the region of $1 billion of aid every year. So it is a major player in terms of charitable giving. It is also still a sovereign state, and it issues its own passports, its own stamps, its own money. And this is very important because it enables the Order of Malta to go to places where it might not otherwise be able to go if it were affiliated or belonged to another country. It is, if you like, outside the political structure. And rather like the United Nations, and perhaps even more than the United Nations, it is able to go and reach parts where other charitable organisations cannot reach, even in the Muslim world, interestingly.
That's very interesting, and part of the Church's noble tradition of caring for the poorest and the sickest and so on. And perhaps this is providential that at the end of the 19th century a brighter future yet beckons, because the world, alas, shows no sign of letting up in wars, famines, hardship and illness and so on. So there will always be plenty for Knights Hospitaller to do in the poorest parts of the world, and it's particularly beautiful they do so in Islamic parts of the world. Perhaps that's a new prophetic witness for this and the next century.
Well, indeed, and the maternity hospital of the Holy Family is situated in Palestine, and right virtually between the State of Israel and the Palestinian territories. There you have a large, effective maternity hospital run by the Order of Malta.
Perhaps as a sign of peace in a troubled land, and perhaps that's exactly the right thing for it to be doing, there and elsewhere. The story of the Knights Hospitaller, the dramatic story of the Siege of Malta. We're Jamie and Joanna Bogle, and we're looking at the religious orders and the Crusades. And the next one that we're going to be looking at in the next episode is the Teutonic Knights and the Baltic